Afternoon, Gabe.
Good afternoon.
So let's start this off with a brief introduction to what this is and why we're recording this right now. And that is because we are starting our margin for thought recorded, or at least the recorded medium for some of these discussions for margin of thought. And margin of thought is intended to be essentially the writings and dialogues between you and myself, and it's supposed to facilitate open discussion about any topic. You know, whether we have a background or are credentialed in that topic or not, I think that it's really important for us to be able to discuss and think about things that vary from a wide range of perspectives and interests. So that's kind of the goal of this, and I'm excited to talk about what we have today. So what's on your mind? And I guess do you have anything else to add to margin for thought, what it's intended to be?
Yes, thanks so much for joining me. For those who don't know, my name is Gabriel. This is Ethan. And yeah, the project, it really isn't one with I wouldn't say it has a very defined thesis, but it's definitely not. I want to distinguish this project from the millions of others out there that are designed to create a place to have discourse. That's not just what this is. That is partly what this is. But this is also a place for rigor. This is a place for study. This is a place for history, context, beauty, truth. This is not just a place where we're going to be throwing a bunch of random things at the wall and seeing what sticks. We're going to be deliberate and we're going to explore, certainly, but I would not say that this is a marketplace of ideas podcast per se. Perhaps there's some value to that, but that's not enough as a descriptor of what we're trying to do here. We are actually trying to build something good. And good doesn't, I don't necessarily mean qualitatively good per se, but good in more of a transcendental sense. Good in the sense that we want to encourage people to think, feel, be good. And so, just real briefly, before we continue to today's subject matter, I did want to quickly meditate on what is the title of this project about? Margin
Do
for
you
thought. What does this mean?
do you want to discuss that? I mean,
Do you want to, or would you rather say that?
I think well, I think that that should be I think that the meaning should be filled out as we continue to have our discussions.
You know what? I appreciate that and I like that. Let's do that.
Yeah.
So hopefully it's somewhat apparent what the name means of our project or what the project of our name means. But if it's not, I'm sure that it will become more apparent as the project continues. With that being said, I wanted to make two preliminary notes before we begin. One of them is a book that I want to recommend for all of you to read. This book is called Bitter Water Opera. It's by Nicolette Polek. Fanny Howe has called this book dense and delicious with God-made language and violent emotion. Um,
When did you
Elisa,
pick up this book?
I picked,
When
it's
did, when
actually
did you
not
pick?
mine. I'm borrowing this book from a friend, dear friend of mine. Um, he picked it up. As a matter of fact, I think that Nicolette gave him this edition and signed it. I'm seeing here in the cover. Um, Elisa Gabbert says that this is a work of subtle spiritual intelligence. And lastly, let's see, Darcy Steinke says that the book is full of beautiful, theologically brilliant prose. So here is the book. It's a beautiful cover. And the book cover was actually painted by Cynthia Talmadge. So I recommend that you all look at her work, and please go purchase and read this book. It's short and it's remarkable. I'm only about 35 pages in, but I'm loving it. Second thing, I'd like to recommend an album to you all. This album is very important to me. I've been listening to it a lot today. The album is called Define the Great Line by the Christian post-hardcore band Underoath. If you're not familiar with this band, you should get familiar with them. They're one of the most important bands in the genre, and they're particularly interesting because they are a well-respected band by Christian and non-Christian fans alike. And this album, I can't remember what year it came out, but it is considered a classic of the genre. And I really recommend it. So those are my two preliminary items for today. The first thing that Ethan, you and I would like to discuss is Amazon. Amazon, interesting. Okay, what is there to be said about Amazon? Well, of course, there's quite a lot to be said. I want to pass it to you. How do you feel like we should kind of begin
Well,
here?
I think that I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are on whether or not Amazon, particularly as an example of a almost monopolistic, maybe even a monopolistic company,
Mhm,
contributes to society, and primarily centered around this question. And that's the question: what effect does Amazon have on the culture? Number one.
mhm,
And are they culpable for the effect that they have on the culture, or the effect, I should say, that they have on the culture? Because obviously Amazon and the accessibility has greatly changed the way that we engage with um, basically with consumerism of all types. And so I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on what effect they have on the culture and whether or not they're culpable for the way that they formulate culture. Those are the two questions that I have today.
Great questions. Um, I'll start with the first. I think that Amazon can be best understood as the outcome of exactly what we would expect from, uh, I guess you could call the natural life cycle of industrial capitalism. Now, reading Marx in particular, I believe Capital Volume 2, it may be Volume 1. I haven't read any of his volumes yet, so I've just seen snippets here and there. I'm not sure exactly where it is that he talks about this, but I think people don't understand that Marx understands capitalism as, first and foremost, a revolutionary ideology, a revolutionary system that changed the world in many ways for the better. Were there some complications, some challenges, in fact, some great evil that were introduced with it, of course, and we're all aware of the way that he diagnoses those things. But people overlook the way that he appreciates it. And one of the things that he talks about is that monopolization is a natural step in the life cycle of this system. Basically, we could think of it as if you reset the entire economy down to zero. Not that that's what happened, but let's just imagine if you did. Imagine if you had a brand new capitalist system where you basically did like state wealth distribution in like a perfectly equitable way across all industries, all people, like all participants in the economy. And then you said, okay, go. And then everybody started building businesses and making crafts and doing everything that they do. Well, what happens about 3, 4, some 100 years down the road after the initiation of that project? Well, eventually, through the kind of dynamics of competition in the market, certain players win and many players lose. And the players that win will continue to win more and more as they pick up momentum, as they accumulate more and more capital. And so what Marx says is that, of course, monopolization is a natural stage. And that's exactly what we've seen. So that's just a little bit of background information saying that Amazon is a great example of what happens at the end of industrial capitalism, if you will, at the end of the life cycle. The competition is basically over, and Amazon won, so to speak. So what role do they play? Well, I mean, honestly, you could basically call them um, they're almost their own state in a certain sense. They are, well, they're almost like their own like privatized Soviet state because for capitalist reasons, they administer the distribution of every good and service you could really almost think of. They've done incredible things with AWS in particular, Amazon Web Services. They have innovated technology in a way that is probably unforeseen, is a good way of putting it. They've made immeasurable positive contributions to the world. I don't think it's controversial to say that. On the other hand, moving along to the second question that you asked, is Amazon culpable for the
Well,
culture of consumerism? Oh, go ahead.
yeah, before you jump into that, I think that the other thing that we had touched on in a conversation that we had earlier is that Amazon also has facilitated a lot of the consumeristic tendencies of the American public. And I'm going to talk about the American public because obviously both of us are Americans. So
Yes.
I'm going to focus on that. But um, they have made the accessibility of goods. Now, you said goods and service, but particularly goods, right? They've made the
Yes.
accessibility of these goods um, beyond what I think anyone had previously imagined possible.
Hmm.
And it reminds me, honestly, it reminds me of I read this book called Team of Teams, or I'm in the process of reading a book called Team of Teams. And it's a really phenomenal book, highly recommend it. But in the book, it discusses this idea of scientific management, which scientific
Hmm.
management was a philosophy that was brought about by a gentleman with his last name was Taylor. I can't remember his first name, but and maybe you could pull it up for me. But the reason I mention scientific management is because it was formulated out of this concept that we now know as Taylorism. And essentially, the background on this is that Taylor brought his steel mill. He was working on running a steel mill, and he brought a steel mill to the World's Fair. And the reason that he did so was because his steel mill was able to, and I might be incorrect in saying this, but I believe the number was, it was able to produce 5 times what any steel mill at the time was able to produce. However, there was no innovation in technology. The only innovation was in the way that he managed the people. And previously in the steel mill, even individuals who worked as a lineman could be considered craftsmen. So even if you, let's say, made tires, well, you had your own way of making tires. You had your own craftsmanship that you put into this, even if you worked on an assembly line. And there was very little standardization pre Taylor. Well, Taylor introduced the idea of standardization, that the workers' roles and responsibilities could be reduced to a very simple list. Specifically, the fastest way to complete those tasks. And so, without continuing to divert too much and bringing it back to our conversation of Amazon, I think Amazon is the quintessential example of Taylorism or scientific management lived out. Every single process in their step is reduced down to very consistent and well regulated tasks. And so they are the most efficient. I think they're an example of where monopolization in a capitalistic society has really thrived because they provide goods and services cheaper than anyone else, faster than anyone else, with more reliability than anyone else. Yet still, the American people are extremely materialistic and extremely consumer focused. And I think some of the language that you had used when we previously discussed this was that more than ever, people are able to essentially order random junk they don't need at any time they want and in any quantities they want with relatively limited or with relatively little limitation, especially with the introduction of credit card debt, which that's a whole nother topic that we can discuss. But
It is
uh,
indeed. That is a big can of worms, especially when you think about it from a political economy and kinds of capital perspective. Like,
yeah,
what are we even doing? Like, why does every single business have its own credit card now? Like,
yeah,
why are airlines, why are they banks? Why are department stores banks? Like, how are
yeah.
all of these institutions becoming their own banks? So it's something that we'll have to probably address in a later episode because I think it's a little bit too far off the beaten path for this one.
Absolutely. We'll definitely have to address it.
Of course we will. And I think we've probably each got some reading to do on that matter to help us inform our conversation a bit more as well. Um, all great things to contribute. Really appreciate the mention of Frederick Winslow Taylor is his name and his principles of scientific management. I think I've maybe encountered this before, but this is such an important thing for us to take into account for this conversation. Because like you're saying, and this is also, if I may say so, you yourself have spent some time with Amazon, correct?
Yep. Yeah.
So you've
I
actually really
I
seen
think
it at work.
there's a lot of people who've worked for Amazon, and I have in my lifetime too.
Yes. Yes.
There was an interesting, I'll tell you, there was a really interesting thing when I left Amazon. And I don't know if this dates when I worked there, but they offered, I think it was somewhere around $2,000 to sign a contract that you would never work for them again. I'm not making this up. This was a very, very interesting exit bonus. And I really am curious what the psychology around that offer was. But I'm completely not joking. And I from every recollection I have, there was it may have been 2000 or 5000 or yeah, it was between 2000 and $5,000, but you had to sign a contract that you would never work for Amazon or one of its subsidiaries. Wild, just wild. And I'm not sure how they would enforce it, honestly, even.
My immediate presumption for why that would be is probably just that they have such a huge influx of applications for employment that they actually can't, like, they need to get people to stop trying to work there or something. I don't know. That's like a very kind of entry level analysis. But do you find another reason maybe more true or more reasonable there?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that there's some level to which I think that there's some subtle psychology there where it's to the point that you don't want to admit. It's like almost a reverse psychology that if you sign off on never working for Amazon or its subsidiaries, you admit that you don't need them. Whereas if you don't sign it, you're kind of subtly acknowledging the idea that you may need Amazon again. And so I think there really is probably something a little bit more sophisticated, but be it something interesting to research for sure.
I think so. Okay, so now let's move into what may be the more, no, let's not say it's more interesting because honestly, I feel like the economic and distributive aspects of Amazon are maybe just as interesting as their, I guess you could say their social aspects, but the social aspects must be discussed. So you talked about culpability. Well, we all know very well. Um, I actually was hanging out with some guy the other day who mentioned to me that he knows someone who orders things on Amazon every single morning, almost in a ritualistic fashion. It's a
Dang.
practice for them. It's actually almost become a religious rite. Um, and what that tells me, of course, is that somehow consumption of products, superfluous consumption, no question, it's superfluous. Um, well, it's now not become, it's not just become kind of a struggle in our culture, but it's just become mainstream. It's become just the thing that the majority of people do on a daily basis and probably do in a somewhat uncritical way. And Ethan, you were talking earlier about how, well, it's probably important to keep in mind that Amazon could not be held solely responsible for creating that. And that's quite true. Of course, Amazon isn't solely responsible, but they definitely, over the course of the growth of their business, they they certainly took great advantage of what may have at the time been a nascently developing thread. And then they cultivated the consumptive tendency in the Western consumer to a grotesque degree. And they worsened it to the point where it is today. Now, they didn't do it alone, but they may have done it foremostly, considering that they are the, at least the West's most prominent distributor of goods. They may have been a primary driver in this cultural shift. And of course, it's hard to hold them accountable and tell them that they ought not have done it, that they ought not have participated, because they're a business participating in what is apparently a capitalist economy, which maybe more on that later. And so their incentive, of course, is to do everything they can to grow their business, to expand it into as many different sectors as they can, to make it succeed, to make it thrive. And they certainly have done that. But as they've done that, my perspective is that they've caused this superfluous consumption to just get worse than it ever has been and that anyone could have ever conceived it to be. So I think that's probably a good summary of how I think. Do you feel like you differ in any way from me there?
Well, on the matter of, I guess, American consumption, I think that number one, I think that satisfying one's desires is nothing new to man. I think that from the beginning of time, people have sought ways to satisfy what they want. And that we live in a culture of accessibility where everything is more accessible and requires less effort than ever before. Um, and this goes for all consumptive interactions that we engage in, whether it's media and entertainment, whether it is um, whether it is access to all of our basic human needs, water, food, shelter, etc., all very accessible. And especially with the adoption of, you know, what's the food delivery service? I never use it; it's too expensive.
You talking
But
about DoorDash?
yeah, like DoorDash or something of that
Mm-hmm.
nature.
Mm-hmm.
And it's especially true too for the market, and especially the consumeristic market that we live in. And so, and you recommended a book to me that I've just started, the Gutenberg Galaxy, by McLuhan, right?
Yes, Marshall
George McLuhan,
McLuhan.
or
Mm-hmm.
Marshall McLuhan, excuse me. And in that book, he discusses how technology is an extension of human function. And I don't want to hammer too much on that book, and I'm sure we'll discuss it more later, but it just reminds me that wherever there's an opportunity for human function to make it to require less effort and to receive more, that's what technology is intended to do. And Amazon, in many ways, including and I think the economy itself, is a function of technology at its very base form. And so, um, when it comes to Amazon, I think that there is a level of peril that comes about when we engage with it, and that is that we have as much access to stuff as we want. And that enables us to lean into, I think, our natural instincts, which is to appease our senses. And I'm sure that I'll refer to it later. So I just want to say that when I mean that, When I mean sensuality, I'm referring to that. I'm referring to appease our senses of sight, smell, touch, taste, feel, etc. So, um, Amazon facilitates that. Now, the question is, when I wonder whether Amazon is culpable in this, I also wonder, is humanity capable, or is the American culture capable of becoming more self-restrained, becoming more um, uh, more self-controlled in regards to our inherent sensuality, in regards to our inherent desire to please our senses, including through the purchasing of objects. I mean, there's many people who have succumbed to addiction to purchasing, right? So in all of those cases, my curiosity is, number one, is humanity capable of that as technology makes it easier and easier to succumb to those things? And if so, does that require intervention, either by organizations like Amazon or by maybe even on a broader scale the government? Or is that the responsibility of the individual to become more self-controlled? Is that the responsibility of the culture to drive towards self-control in opposition of our technology, in opposition of accessibility? And so those are the things that I'm curious about, and I wonder about.
Well, I tell you, I'm curious about the same things, and there's a lot to unpack there. To me, I feel like the question that you're asking really can be boiled down to, and you kind of hinted at this, can things get better? Can really anything get better? I mean, because that's kind of the core of the question. It's, if you think about it, when you ask the question, can X thing get better? What you're saying is, well, let's just say that the physical component of a development, let's just say the technology of Amazon. And technology, we don't just mean the computer systems. We mean technology in a McLuhan sense.
Mm-hmm.
Technology in a more expanded understanding as literally an extension of human function, human kind
Yeah.
of default bodily or even mental function. But technology we know has kind of developed alongside and in kind of reciprocity with culture. And of course we know that kind of at different points in history, each one of these strands has had a causal effect on the other, but it's certainly not like monodirectional. It's not that one is always causing the other. I don't believe. And I know that McLuhan has a lot to say about that, and we'll be getting into that. But I guess what we're thinking about more specifically here is, okay, well, if Amazon has developed into this almost like self-contained economic model that is incredibly impressive from a historical perspective, but it has also kind of the ladder that it climbed to get to where it is was almost like the ladder of human consumptive tendency. And that each
Yep.
rung of the ladder that it climbed marked another notch in our movement toward a further and further, again, kind of consumptive way of being. And so the question lies here: how can we break away? Or obviously, should we? I think the answer is, if we can, we should. Um,
Do you think so?
Absolutely, yes.
Well, let me interject with this too. And in past we've discussed this too, and that is, what is the end? What is the end direction that technology as a whole is headed towards? And so, if indeed the use of technology facilitates this ultimate goal for uh, the ultimately accessible sensuality, I'll say, um, then then what does technology at its end point, at the end development of technology, what does that look like? And I honestly think that it's very akin to the Matrix. And before before you say that's ridiculous, I want to point out something that's in our current time frame that's happening. And a perfect example of this is the innovation and developments in Elon Musk's, uh, what am I trying to say? Um,
SpaceX,
Not SpaceX, Neuralink.
Neuralink,
Neuralink.
of course, yes.
Yeah, so direct injection of uh, mental stimulation, neurological stimulation into the brain via technology.
Hmm.
And it's not hard to jump to the conclusion that if this becomes possible, which I believe it will, uh, if it becomes possible to control the stimulus, neurological stimulus, then entire hallucinations will be within our reach. So much so that entire artificial representations of the causal reward system that we as human beings are so dependent on will become entirely available through and via technology. And so um, the question then becomes, well, is technology good? And if that when that question is posed, the automatic response, I think, by everyone would be yes, it is, because the benefit of technology on humanity is increased health, increased lifespan, more accessibility to each other. Well, that might be a good one to discuss because whether or not we as human beings are actually more in touch
Hmm.
because of technology, I think that's maybe a debatable topic. But
It is indeed.
nonetheless, people would state that as an immediate response. And as someone who works in technology for my profession,
Hmm.
and I'm sure you would share the same sentiment,
As do I, yes.
um, we work with some level of felt altruism that we're doing good for society by what we do. And I think that's the belief of everyone who works using technology.
Hmm.
But this does not change the fact that humanity is on a trajectory towards this unlimited sensuality, this unlimitedly accessible sensuality. Um, and that's something that's concerning to me. Now,
Mm.
on the point of Amazon, and I don't want to just monologue here, but on the point of Amazon, I think that there's an interesting point to note that Amazon, as you said, may be a product, maybe almost uh, a default product of the rungs of technology that we're climbing up. That if it weren't Amazon, it would have been some other company that provided this accessibility. Now, I think that could also be debated, but regardless, I do believe that in our society there is a growing desire for quality rather than just product.
Yes,
And
I can
I think the
feel it too.
evidences of this, and I think the word you used was the desire for artisanship. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that. What is your opinion on potentially the supply and demand curve um, merging away from Amazon and merging towards some more artisanship?
Well, the thing is, you might be able to speak on that with more authority and experience than I can because I'm not really aware of the details of that. I know that earlier you and I were talking and you mentioned that you're starting to see that. I was actually wondering where, like, how have you seen that? I know that I mean, you might be in like different markets for purchasing different products than I am. So speak on that a little bit. I'm not as really aware of these things as you.
Well, and most of my observations are entirely anecdotal, so I don't have a lot of data or research on this. But
Don't worry about that.
the microbreweries, how all those
Mm-hmm.
microbreweries were popping up. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's kind of a microcosm of this effect, right? People were interested in local, new. They didn't just want to buy Bud Light and my favorite beer, Guinness. They didn't just want to buy, the off the shelf out of the grocery store beers. They wanted to go to a microbrewery with
Mm.
friends and engage in new experiences. And and participate in artisanship. Now, again, microbreweries, I think, are just an example of this. I think there's a lot of examples. For instance,
Mm-hmm.
a couple of my interests, right, as you know, woodworking and metalsmithing, and
Mm-hmm.
I see a lot of examples, a number of examples where people are more and more interested in purchasing things from makers, like, for instance, Etsy and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
So now, again, we can talk about Etsy, and there's a flooding market of Chinese produced uh,
Oh,
uh,
interesting.
products on Etsy. But regardless, I think that there is a growing market for this. And
Hmm.
I think that it's in response to a lot of the commercialization of some of these products. And even for those people who
Possible.
are less interested in the commercial products, I still think that there's, even for those people, or who may not have pinpointed the commercialization aspect, like if you go into Target, they have this, oh, I don't remember what it's called. It's some fancy marketing name like Oak and Leaf or something like that, you know. But anyway, they have this product line
Mm,
that almost emulates, almost as a
yeah.
facade of
Yes.
craftsmanship. They have like marbles and woods and metals and
Mm-hmm.
things of that nature instead of, plastics and
Yes.
polymers and things of that nature. So I think it's really interesting to see people shift towards this almost artisan aesthetic. Um,
Yes. Yes. Definitely.
and of
I
course, I'm sorry, one
Go
last
ahead.
thing. Where there's a demand, commercialization will seek to fulfill it, which is why
That's
Target has come out with
exactly
that.
that's where I was going to take this is I really like that you brought it to this point because it reminded me of something very important, which is that currently we live, I think it's fair to say, and most I think that most mainstream kind of economic analysts would agree with this. You and I, being in the US and being in the West more broadly, we live in neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is it's a word that is certainly a buzz term. People don't necessarily know what it means. We're definitely going to get into it a lot more detail over the course of our program. But a good way of thinking about it in this context is through its social aspect. I think that neoliberalism can be thought of in two ways. It can be thought of as, first and foremost, a set of economic policies, but it can also be thought of as a social movement. And Byung-Chul Han, who's an author who's a few of whose books I've read and who I think has a lot of really valuable contributions to make to diagnosing and understanding the contemporary way of life. He talks about neoliberalism essentially as the flattening of all human interaction and all human behavior, even into transactional data. And so, what that will mean in its implication for yours and my conversation here today is that as demand begins to rise for artisanship and for microbreweries and for kind of these like mom and pop shop things, large centers of capital, large centers of economic power, if you will look at this demand and go, oh, well, we would love to hire like a consulting firm to help us build a great product that perfectly checks all of these boxes. And they'll probably do it in such a way, and I'm sure that this is already happening. They'll do it in such a way that they'll probably be able to market it using, a third party corporation. It's like an LLC. That's a subsidiary of another, but you would have to actually be reading a bunch of bank documents that are probably publicly available, but you won't read them. Nobody will read them. They'll see like, you know, warm wooden furniture LLC or something. I don't know. The Olive Grove. Okay, how about that? Y'all ever heard of this new spot, the Olive Grove? They got all this really cool, like handmade furniture. It's really great. And little do you know, it's actually what is it's actually well, fill in the blank with a large furniture manufacturer. It's actually just a subsidiary firm of a large furniture manufacturer. And so I'm just kind of providing a whole lot of supporting material to contribute to your statement that, I mean, I really do think that the age of the little guy really building his way all the way up to being the biggest guy. I think that we're long past that. And you can hear all of these feel-good stories that are propaganda material to tell you that if you're at the bottom, you can make it. And you know what? Maybe you can. Maybe you can, but you're probably not going to, because probably your great idea is going to get swooped right out from under you, and you will have no idea how anybody found out about it. And then you're going to find it on the shelf at Walmart in 1 year. And then you're going to go, well, how am I going to compete with this? This is my idea. And here it is at my local conglomerate product seller. Now, if you have anything else to say on that matter, please do feel free to chime in. If not, I'd love if we could continue on to our next topic. What do you think?
Yeah, the last thing I will say on that is that one of the things that I think commercialization struggles with, but really wants to perfect, is the social capital of relationships. And there have been many marketing structures that have facilitated, the relying on the social capital. For instance, MLMs, or more commonly known as pyramid schemes,
Mm-hmm.
rely on social networks. I mean, that is the critical operative mode for their marketing. But I think those things tend to very quickly fizzle out. Or not fizzle out, but while they can capture a market share, I don't think they can ever exhaustively capture that market share. Because at the end of the day, I think that a lot of people still do want my neighbor's handmade furniture. You know, there is a lot to be said about that. And while my neighbor's handmade furniture store is never going to compete with a Target, the reality is, more than likely, as long as they can build business within their network, they'll continue to sell to those people because those people want to support that individual. Now, this isn't true everywhere, but I do think that this is particularly true in some ways. Well, I think in some ways that in a rural environment, this can be very true because there's a lot of relationships, there's a lot of you know, um, co-participation in building and contributing to that community. In a different way, it can be facilitated in cities where word of mouth can get around, but I think it's a lot easier for commercialization in cities for, like you said, Olive Grove as your example, just to be a subsidiary, right? Just to be bought out. And honestly, in many cities, I think that's the goal. If you're a small business and someone offers to buy you out, I mean, you've made it. That's the goal. So, uh,
Which is pretty
regardless,
hilarious if you think about it. And it's so different from how kind of I guess like if I may say so, the capitalist propagandists, like the people that give you like a stick figure idea of how the economy works, they don't really take that into account. They don't take into account the fact that small business owners, in many cases, would love to sell out. They would love to just consolidate, kind of liquidate their capital and just move along and kind of live a life. Not everybody wants to be a business owner, which I completely understand, but it just introduces more complications into how these things function, right?
yeah. No, the last thing I'll say on this is I don't think that commercialization will ever kill the small guy because I do believe that there are many, many, many people who do what they do because they love to do what they do. And they will continue to do it whether it's the most profitable or not. And I know many people like this who sell their product even though the profit margins aren't optimal, even though no large organization is going to want to buy them out. They still do what they do because they love what they do and they want to create a product. And people buy it because they're invested in them as individuals. And this is, I think this is very true also in the art scene, in the music scene, which you're much more familiar than I am. But I mean, I'm sure that you've seen this where people centralize around an individual because they're invested in that individual's success and not because it's offered as something even that they're maybe even that they're interested in. Some people maybe just invest in the people rather than the product itself. So, there is this aspect of the economy that I think will always be an undercurrent and will always live on. And I'm optimistic about that. At the end of the day, Amazon does what they do better than anyone else. And as long as people want what Amazon has to offer, Amazon will continue to do it. So I think that's there's much more to be said on this topic, but that's all I have for now.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I mean, this is something that will play an important role in many of the conversations that we have going forward. So it's not like this is a closure of that subject matter.
Yeah.
The next thing that I wanted us to discuss, bit of a departure from the current topic, but I still think it'll bear some great fruit as a matter of discussion. Vasily Kandinsky was born in 1866, passed away in 1944. He was a Russian painter and art theorist. And if you're into the history of art, odds are you know who this is. He's a person who has name recognition within the art world, and particularly with those who are familiar with art history. I wouldn't say that he has name recognition outside of that domain. He also studied law and economics. Um, he was not, I don't know if he was exactly a polymath, but certainly probably more of a polymath than many people today are, and certainly an aspirational figure to me. Now, I bring him up because Vasily Kandinsky had a notable nephew, and his nephew is someone who's far lesser known. This is a man named Alexandre Kojève. Kojève was born in 1902. He died in 1968. He was a Russian-born French philosopher and statesman who he actually was influential in the founding of the EU. And he also delivered a series of lectures between, I believe, 1933 and 1939 about Hegel's seminal text, The Phenomenology of Spirit. And the lecture notes on those lectures can be read in a volume that is now published today called Introduction to the Reading of Hegel, Lectures on the Phenomenology of Spirit. Now, I read this book last year and found it, I will admit, extremely challenging to read. But honestly, so worth it. And I'm very glad I did. And it is a book that I will be returning to many times over the course of my life. I bring up Kojève because just the other day, it may have actually been last night, I was on a drive and I was listening to, I have a buddy, Barrett Avner. He has a podcast called Contain. And he was doing this podcast about the history of volcanoes, volcanology, and mythology and art relating to volcanoes. And just as an interesting kind of comment, he mentioned that Kojève had written about representational art. And what he said, and by the way, before we continue, representational art, as we're using it in this context, basically means art that is intended to represent a real object, if you will, or a real material object, a corporeal thing. So a landscape piece could be considered a representational painting. Maybe a still life or a portrait. These would all be representational. Now, what Kojève says is that representational art is probably more subjective than abstract art. That kind of flips the paradigm that we all kind of tend to go by on a day-to-day basis, because we would think that Well, art that represents an abstract concept or that depicts or attempts to sketch out an abstract concept, well, certainly that's highly subjective. And then on the other hand, representational pieces would be less so. But what he says is that if a person is attempting to depict a representation of a material thing, they are necessarily bringing into the piece that they create an enormous, perhaps even incalculable amount of historical and contextual baggage. What has this artist experienced in their own past relating to the subject matter of the piece, for example? Maybe they had a formative childhood experience on a lake and they're making a painting about the lake. And so now the painting that contains a lake has this kind of you don't even really know what it is as you're looking at it, but you can sense something deeper beneath the surface, if you will, forgive the pun, beneath the surface of the deep, of the waves of this lake. There's something going on there. It's highly subjective. So I just wanted to introduce this idea and pass it to you, Ethan. What do you think about this? Do you feel like this is reasonable? Because I find it quite compelling.
Yeah, Gabe. The my main thoughts when hearing this center around this idea of shared meaning because art is a really interesting subject as far as what constitutes art, what is the intention of art, what's the purpose of art, and I think there's even within between intention and purpose, there's a very subtle distinction that uh, is very important to define as an artist contributing to art because you may have an intention, but the purpose of art differs from your intention, etc. So I think that I think it's really important to consider shared meaning, and we as human beings invest a lot in communicating shared meaning. And I think most artists tend to try and produce some level of shared meaning or shared experience with their art. Now, this isn't entirely true. I think that this is a much more classical view of art, that you're trying to relay some meaning with your art. Whereas I think a more, and I'm not an expert in artistic theory, but with I think a lot of modern art perspectives, the goal is really to express oneself through the art. And so the intention and the purpose, both of them may deviate from actually communicating some sort of message. Now, insofar as the concept of abstract art versus representative art carrying more or less subjectivity than the other, this is what I think. I think that abstract art in its purest form is entirely subjective, which means that abstract art in its purest form may relay no meaning whatsoever, but the meaning may be extracted by the beholder. So that individual who's perceiving the art itself will define what things that they actually see within the art, what meaning that they garner from the art, how they relate to the art itself, um, which may be entirely 100% different from the artist's intention, which means that the purpose of the art differed from, or let me say, not just the artist's intention, but the artist's perspective on the art. So the artist makes this piece of art. They're expressing themselves, which may be entirely different from what the individual reads out of that art, who beholds it, who's not the artist themselves, but the consumer of the art. Now, with representative art, the goal is to communicate. Um, now, at, in every art, in every artistic piece, one expresses themselves. But with representative art, the goal is to communicate some level of shared meaning to the consumer of the art. So if I create a representation of something, my goal, like if I, for instance, your example, the lake, if I create a lake, my goal, my intention is for the person who consumes the art to see a lake. And and more than likely, if I am creating some sort of representative art, I also want them to share in some emotion regarding that object in particular, or that experience. So I think that in some ways, representative art may be actually less subjective because there is shared meaning derived from the art piece itself. And shared meaning in some levels may be more objective than the absence of shared meaning. But I think that this goes into the semantics of what does subjective mean and what does the objective mean. Um,
Okay, there's a lot here, of course, which I love. Something that I must introduce is something which you may be a little bit less familiar with than I am, which is what I would call materials adjacent to art. Um, let's just think about a painting. Somebody makes a painting, and then there are immediately kind of adjacent or ancillary aspects that come alongside the painting if anything else happens to it. Somebody might create a painting and then leave it in their attic and never do anything with it. Nobody else in the whole world ever sees it. They don't ever think about it again. They don't name it. They don't try to put it in a show. They don't try to contextualize it or have it kind of set it in conversation with any other art. But let's set that instance to the side and talk about, well, what happens to an art piece when it actually is released to the world? Well, when you release a piece to the world, you have to come up with a title. There is automatically a year attached to it, which kind of temporally places the piece. It tells the person looking at it, this piece was made at this time. And so perhaps that's valuable. Perhaps that's relevant to understanding the piece. And then, maybe most importantly of all, there is the concept of the press release. The press release, as I'm sure we're all aware, but I'll just provide my idea of what it is. The press release is, you could call it almost a short essay that is composed to accompany and perhaps explain or disambiguate a gallery show. And so what that means is that when a person goes to see art in a gallery, they're going to encounter a number of things. They're going to encounter the pieces themselves. And they're also going to encounter descriptive text and information that gives further meaning to the piece than merely the actual article of art. And so I just wanted to kind of include that here because I think that we'll want to refer back to it. I also wanted to challenge you a little bit. I don't think that artists necessarily make art with an audience in mind. I think that you're kind of assuming that. I myself don't think that in my art making, which is primarily musical, I don't make it with an audience in mind. I make it because, well, first of all, I make it because I feel compelled to. I make it because I want to. I make it because it's almost spewing forth from me. And I feel like if you speak to a lot of artists, they'll tell you the same thing. In fact, there are many artists who find it quite alienating and perhaps even hate showing other people their art because it's not for other people. Now,
yeah.
that may not be the case for everybody. But that's another important aspect here, because if somebody is going and creating a painting of a lake, well, they're not necessarily creating that painting so that they can show someone else, here, look at what I think a lake looks like. They
Yeah.
might just be doing it for reasons that are kind of beyond their own understanding, and they may never show anyone. So
Do
it's
you
maybe
think
more complicated.
do you think though that now I agree with you as far as whether or not art is created with an audience in mind. I completely agree with that. I think most of the artistic things that I've done in my life um, have been intentioned out of a desire to express something within myself using that medium. Now, my question for you is, when it comes to the creation of abstract art and representative art, because I think that whether the artist births that art out of themselves and inspiration within themselves, or whether they create it to be viewed by other people, I do think that they do make the decision whether or not they're going to make abstract or representative art. I do think they make that decision, because that's a decision of format. That's a decision that's almost like decide,
It's
it's
a
like
decision of form.
yeah,
Yes.
it's the difference between choosing a sketch versus a painting versus music. You
I think that's
intention in
true.
yourself to create that format.
Now, I will say, of course, there are many pieces that probably blur the line between representational and
Absolutely.
abstract.
What was that? What was the piece that you used in your first post for Margin for Thought, the circle within
Are you talking
circles?
about Circles in a Circle by
Yes.
Kandinsky?
Yep.
Yes. I would
Yeah,
say that that
so
is an example of a highly abstract, non-representational
I
piece.
would agree. I would agree. Whereas maybe um, one of the pieces that I used was representative of the Black Death,
Mm,
but it's very representative. It's not, and it's not. It doesn't pass into realism.
hmm.
It doesn't pass into realism. But regardless,
Interesting.
I I want to highlight or this question, which is, with the decision of abstraction or representation, do you think that that's a decision of meaning as well? Do you think that that's a decision of information that you're trying to contribute to the art piece itself?
Clarify that question a little bit. What do you mean when you say, is it a question of information?
Well, I would proposition that in front based off of what you described, the abstract versus representative art, that representative art carries more information, including contextual information, including description, um, whereas abstract art carries less information. So, with that, in the same way as a artist decides form, do you believe that the difference between the choice in abstract versus representative art, there is a decision of meaning as well? And I'm not sure what I'm exactly getting at that question, but it is
Fair,
a
fair.
question. It's a question I have.
I'll reflect on it. And I also think that I want to respond a little bit to your conception of the comparison between these two things. I think that I somewhat understand your contention because I also feel the pull toward that interpretation because to me, that's the normal interpretation. That's the interpretation that makes the most intuitive, common sense, if you
Mm,
will. Um, but I just feel like it's interesting to challenge that and think about the fact that I almost wonder if an endeavor is more subjective if you are doing it with less conscious intent, and that a work becomes more objective as your intent pertaining to it becomes more clarified. And this to me is the difference. This to me is why this question maybe leans more towards Kojève's interpretation. Because if a painter is not thinking about any of these concepts, they're just feeling, for whatever reason, compelled to paint this lake that we've been discussing. They go and make it. And then that's pretty much it. Perhaps they name it and then it finds a home in a gallery somewhere. Well, they probably weren't thinking too much about what are the kind of abstract baggage aspects of this work that I'm creating. They're probably just creating it. And so that introduces so many kind of overlapping, intersecting, perhaps conflicting subjective aspects to the piece. Now, on the other hand, what if you, in almost kind of a philosophical context, have an idea that you have come up with? You've constructed some sort of abstract idea. and you feel like this idea might be depicted or maybe delivered well or transmitted well, if you will, uh, using kind of an abstract form of visual art. Well, sure, you're probably still importing baggage, but you're taking so much more conscious intent with the creation of the piece, and it's so much more focused on almost an external object that doesn't have any materiality to it. That to me, I feel like that may be more objective. And so, what would you say to that?
Um, the I think that the translation of meaning. I think music's a great forum to discuss revolving around this because with painting, the level of abstraction can go, I think, beyond what the level of abstraction in music can be. Because you may disagree in this, but I think at some point, music can become so extremely abstract that it's no longer intelligible. In the same way, I think art can actually do the same thing, or at least the visual mediums of art. Let me be more specific. Um, and so in that, I'm curious as to the value, and this is an interesting, like, I think this is an interesting question to propose, and that's the value proposition of intelligible art forms. But I
Hmm.
think that we could probably discuss this more on our next recording. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's definitely more to dig into, but I think that we've done a decent job for our first episode. What do you think?
I
Want to
love it.
call it for
I
today?
always love chatting with you.
I think
Yeah.
this was outstanding. Yeah, I'm really pleased with this.
Yeah. And on this subject, we probably leave some margin for thought. So,
Yeah, yeah, agreed. Okay,
all right, Gabe.
well,
Thanks.
always a pleasure chatting. Glad that we're starting this up, and God bless.
God bless you. Thanks, man.